Number 10. The fabric that wealthy women wore proudly while it slowly consumed them from the inside. Picture a fashionable woman in mid-19th century Paris standing in front of a mirror. She is dressed for an evening event. Her gown is a deep, vivid green, the kind of green that made other colors look dull by comparison. The color was called Sheely's green, and it was everywhere. It was on wallpaper, on artificial flowers, on painted toys, on curtains, and most prominently, on the fabric of dresses worn by women who considered themselves among the better-dressed members of society. The color was achieved using copper arsenite, a compound built on arsenic. The green was so striking, so commercially desirable, that manufacturers across Europe produced it by the ton throughout the mid to late 1800s. The people wearing it had no particular reason to be afraid. It looked beautiful. It felt like clothing. It behaved like clothing. It was, as far as anyone understood, simply a fashionable dye. The mechanism of harm was slow, and for a long time, invisible. Arsenic compounds embedded in fabric or wallpaper did not remain stable forever. In warm or humid environments, particularly in rooms with poor ventilation or in clothing worn close to the skin, the arsenic could volatilize into a gas. Certain molds that grew on damp wallpaper were later found to metabolize arsenic-containing pigments into a toxic gaseous compound called trimethylarsine. But even without that biological transformation, the arsenic particles in fabric dye could shed onto skin, be inhaled as dust, or transfer to hands, and then to food. The exposure was continuous, low-level, and compounded over months and years. The workers who made these dresses and manufactured these dyes were in the most immediate danger. Artificial flower makers in London and Paris, mostly young women who worked in cramped rooms constructing fake blooms from arsenite-dyed fabric, developed ulcerated skin, inflamed eyes, persistent coughs, and neurological symptoms that their employers and physicians struggled to categorize. A number of medical observers in the 1860s and 1870s began connecting these symptoms to the materials the women handled daily, but the commercial pressure to keep producing the green was formidable. The color sold. The market demanded it. For the women wearing the gowns, the risk was less concentrated, but still real. Prolonged skin contact with arsenite-dyed fabric over months or years could produce the characteristic signs of chronic arsenic exposure. Skin lesions, peripheral nerve damage, digestive problems, and a slow, cumulative weakening of the body's systems. The symptoms were vague enough to be attributed to almost anything else, which is precisely what happened. Victorian medicine had no shortage of diagnoses for women with general weakness and poor health, and almost none of them pointed toward the color of their dresses. It was not until public pressure, a handful of determined physicians, and some prominent deaths in rooms decorated with arsenic wallpaper drove the issue into public discussion that the practice began to slow. William Morris, the influential designer whose company produced some of the most celebrated wallpapers of the era, was personally resistant to accepting that arsenic in his papers caused harm, though the evidence was accumulating. It was only in the 1870s and 1880s that the use of arsenical dyes in fabric began to decline, not because of any formal ban, but because enough consumers and physicians had grown suspicious of the green. The danger was not strange. It was ordinary enough to be trusted. A woman bought a dress because it was beautiful. A manufacturer used a dye because it produced a marketable color. A shopkeeper sold both without question. The system required no malice. It only required the absence of knowledge and the presence of commerce. And for several decades, those two things were more than sufficient. What came next on this list is something even more intimate. Not fabric against skin, but water inside the body. Number 9. The glass of water that towns served their residents until doctors started counting the bodies. There is a particular kind of trust that communities place in water. It comes from the ground, from rivers, from wells that families have drawn from for generations. It is the most fundamental thing a person consumes, and for most of recorded human history, the fact that it came from a familiar source was considered reassurance enough. In 19th century industrial cities, that trust became one of the most efficient delivery mechanisms for mass death that the era ever produced. Cholera is caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. When it enters the body through contaminated water or food, it colonizes the small intestine and produces a toxin that causes the intestinal lining to flood the gut with fluid. The resulting diarrhea is so severe and so rapid that a person can lose lethal quantities of fluid within hours. Death from dehydration can follow within a single day. The speed of the disease made it terrifying in a way that slower illnesses were not. A person could go to bed in reasonable health and be dead before the following afternoon. Between the 1820s and the 1890s, cholera swept across the world in multiple pandemic waves. It moved through trade routes and pilgrimage paths, through river systems and port cities. It killed in Russia, in France, in Egypt, in India, in the United States. In some cities, particularly those where population density had outpaced any organized system of waste removal or clean water supply, it killed in numbers that were almost incomprehensible to the people living through it. London in the mid-19th century was drinking its own sewage. The city drew water from the River Thames at points where sewage and industrial waste were also discharged. The cesspits beneath houses were overflowing. The streets in poorer neighborhoods were frequently saturated with waste. The smell was extraordinary, but smell was not considered the mechanism of disease. The dominant theory of the time held that disease spread through miasma, meaning contaminated air, particularly the foul-smelling vapors rising from rotting organic matter. The theory was wrong, but it was coherent, and it explained enough observations to remain credible for decades. A physician named John Snow in London suspected the water supply was the actual mechanism of cholera transmission. During an 1854 outbreak centered on Broad Street in the Soho district, he mapped the cases against the location of water pumps and found a striking concentration of deaths among households using a single pump. He interviewed residents, traced the outbreak's geography, and eventually persuaded local authorities to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump. The outbreak had already been declining when the handle was removed, and exactly how much the pump's closure contributed to ending that particular cluster is something historians continue to discuss. But Snow's investigation was among the earliest applications of epidemiological reasoning, connecting the pattern of a disease to a specific environmental source. What Snow's work revealed, and what took decades more to fully translate into policy, was that the ordinary act of drinking water from a familiar neighborhood source could transmit a disease that killed within hours. The danger was not the water's appearance or taste. Cholera-contaminated water is typically clear and odorless. There was no warning sign that a person at a street pump or a household well in 1854 London could have read, assessed, and acted upon. The water looked like water. It had always looked like water. The risk was entirely invisible to the senses and entirely invisible to the dominant theory of disease. The populations most vulnerable were those in cramped urban tenements with no alternative water supply. Wealthier households with private cisterns or access to different water sources had measurably lower death rates during the same outbreaks. The geography of cholera mortality in 19th century cities is also a geography of poverty. The record preserves the statistics. What it cannot preserve is the experience of a family drawing water from the same source their neighbors had used without incident for years, with no reason to stop. The bodies of contaminated water were not the only place disease hid inside a familiar routine. Sometimes it hid inside something far more trusted, something that mothers were specifically advised to give their children. Number 8. The remedy that sat in every medicine cabinet for a century while it quietly built a tolerance for poison. Walk into an ordinary American or European household in the year 1890 and open the medicine cabinet. Among the bottles you are likely to find is one containing a solution of opium dissolved in alcohol, frequently branded under names like laudanum or any number of proprietary preparations. You might also find a bottle of a soothing syrup marketed specifically for children who were teething. Several of the most widely sold of these syrups, including products like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, contained morphine. Some contained alcohol. Some contained both. They were sold without prescription in pharmacies, general stores, and by traveling merchants, and their packaging presented them as safe, gentle relief for the distress of infants. The use of opium as a medicine had roots going back thousands of years. Egyptian medical papyri reference poppy preparations for calming children. Arab physicians of the medieval period wrote extensively on opium's properties. Laudanum, the alcohol-opium mixture, became standard in European medical practice from the 17th century onward, used for pain, diarrhea, coughs, insomnia, and the management of almost any condition that required calming the patient. The problem was not that opiates were without genuine medical utility. The problem was the complete absence of any understanding of dosing, dependency, or the particular vulnerability of children and infants to respiratory depression. Morphine, the primary active alkaloid in opium, suppresses the central nervous system. In adults, recreational or therapeutic doses produce sedation and pain relief. In infants, the margin between a dose that quiets a child and a dose that stops the child's breathing is dangerously narrow. Caretakers administering these syrups were following the label directions, trusting that a product sold for children would be safe for children. There was no regulatory body in the United States requiring safety testing before the early 20th century. In Britain, some controls on labeling existed before American regulation, but even these were slow and incomplete. The actual death toll from patent medicine containing opiates and alcohol during the 19th century is genuinely difficult to calculate. Infant deaths were not well documented, causes of death were often recorded vaguely, and the families administering these syrups had no reason to connect the remedy to the death. A child who was given soothing syrup before bed and did not wake up might have their death attributed to convulsions, to teething complications, to any of the many vague categories under which infant mortality was recorded in that era. Victorian and Edwardian era households also used these preparations for adults dealing with chronic pain, anxiety, and what was frequently called nervous exhaustion. The development of physical dependency was recognized at least partially by some physicians, but the social framing of the time attributed it largely to personal weakness or moral failure rather than to the pharmacological properties of the substance itself. Women who had been prescribed laudanum for menstrual pain or grief found themselves chemically dependent on it, unable to stop without severe withdrawal, and without any medical framework that would direct them toward treatment rather than censure. The Pure Food and Drug Act in the United States, passed in 1906, required that products containing opiates, cocaine, alcohol, and several other substances disclose those ingredients on the label. It did not immediately ban them. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup continued to be sold with its morphine content listed until it was finally discontinued in 1930. The danger persisted long after the mechanism was understood, because the commercial system around these products was too established and too profitable to dismantle quickly. What makes this entry particularly unsettling is not the malice of manufacturers, though some certainly prioritized profit. It is that the caretakers giving these remedies to children were trying to help. The medicine cabinet, the pharmacy counter, the trusted remedy passed down from a grandmother were all ordinary, unremarkable parts of domestic life. The danger required no extraordinary circumstances to enter the room. It was already inside it. If medicine cabinets concealed one kind of slow poison, the walls around those cabinets sometimes concealed another. Number 7. The rooms that people sealed tightly to stay warm, not knowing that the warmth was already becoming lethal. In Northern Europe and in the northeastern regions of North America, the winter presented a genuine and immediate survival problem for much of recorded history. A household that could not maintain adequate heat through the coldest months faced frostbite, hypothermia, and death. The fireplace, and later the coal stove, and the cast iron heating stove were not luxuries, they were essential infrastructure. The desire to retain their warmth, to plug drafts, to seal windows and doors against the cold, was entirely rational. In that context, the decision to make a room as airtight as possible was not negligence, it was prudence. Carbon monoxide is produced when carbon-based fuels burn in conditions of insufficient oxygen. A wood fire in a well-ventilated room burns cleanly. A charcoal brazier in a sealed room can become lethal within hours. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin in the blood far more effectively than oxygen does, gradually displacing the oxygen-carrying capacity of the blood and depriving tissues of what they need to function. Early symptoms include headache, dizziness, and nausea, symptoms that in a cold, tired person trying to stay warm through a difficult night could easily be dismissed as the effects of fatigue or of the cold itself. As the concentration increases, confusion sets in. The person becomes less capable of making the decision to leave the room or open a window. In advanced exposure, they lose consciousness and die. The heating arrangements in medieval and early modern European homes varied enormously by wealth. Wealthy households had large fireplaces with functional chimneys. Poorer households in some regions used central hearths in single rooms, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the structure. The gaps in the structure that allowed smoke to escape also allowed fresh air to enter, which meant that, paradoxically, a poorly built house was sometimes safer from carbon monoxide poisoning than a well-built one. As housing construction improved and homes became better sealed, the risk from carbon monoxide in enclosed spaces potentially increased for people using braziers, poorly maintained stoves, or heating systems with blocked or defective flues. In medieval Japan, homes using charcoal burning hibachi for warmth faced similar risks in closed rooms during winter nights. The practice was widespread, the alternative was genuine cold, and the risk was not understood as a risk at all. It was understood as the cost of warmth, or more precisely, it was not understood at all because the deaths it produced were attributed to other causes. Coal gas, introduced as a domestic fuel for lighting and later for heating in the 19th century, introduced a different but related hazard. Leaks in the gas supply lines running through houses could fill rooms with gas, which was not carbon monoxide but was toxic and flammable. Gaslit homes in Victorian Britain experienced accidental poisoning and explosion events from improperly maintained systems, and the installation of gas lighting was done with varying levels of care, depending on the contractor and the neighborhood. What made carbon monoxide so specifically dangerous across all of these contexts was its invisibility. It has no color, no odor, and no taste. A family asleep in a sealed room with a failing stove had no sensory information warning them that their air was being replaced by a gas that was binding to their blood. The only warning sign was the physical symptoms of exposure, and by the time those symptoms were severe enough to constitute an unmistakable alarm, the capacity to act on that alarm was already compromised. Coroners in 18th and 19th century England documented numerous household deaths attributed to charcoal fumes or coal gas, and the pattern was recognized well before any widespread solution was available. Understanding that the danger existed did not provide ordinary households with a practical way to escape it. The choice, particularly in winter, was between cold and risk. The walls of the home held carbon monoxide. What was beneath those homes held something that moved on its own. Number 6. The streets that every city resident walked daily, where the ground itself was cultivating something that could end a life within days. Stand on a cobblestone street in any major European city in 1750 and look down. The stone beneath your feet is layered over centuries of compressed organic matter. Horse manure accumulates daily in quantities that no contemporary waste removal system can fully address. Household slop, kitchen waste, human waste from overflowing cesspits, the remains of animals slaughtered in nearby markets, the runoff from tanneries and dye works and butchers all converge on the street surface, and the gutters running along its edges. In London alone, the horse population in the mid-19th century numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and each horse produced roughly 10 kilograms of manure per day. The mathematics of that accumulation are striking. The dominant risk in this environment was not injury from slipping on wet cobbles, though that was real. The primary biological danger was the transmission of enteric disease through fecal contamination of hands, food, and water. Typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi, was endemic in 19th century urban populations and spread through contaminated water and food. The roots of contamination ran directly through the street environment. Market produce sat in contact with street surfaces. Street food vendors handled goods with hands that had touched contaminated surfaces. Children played on streets that were saturated with infectious material. Water sources, as discussed in the cholera entry, collected runoff from these same streets. But the street surface introduced another vector that is sometimes underestimated. Tetanus, caused by the bacterium Clostridium tetani, survives in soil and in the feces of animals, including horses. Its spores can remain viable in contaminated earth for years. A person who suffered a puncture wound, a cut from a stone, a torn nail, or a laceration from a fall on a cobblestone street contaminated with horse manure had a genuine pathway for tetanus infection. The disease causes progressive, agonizing muscular rigidity. The jaw muscles are often affected first, which is why the condition acquired the name lockjaw. Without the antitoxin treatment that became available in the late 19th century, tetanus was frequently fatal. Before the germ theory of disease was established and accepted, the connection between an animal's manure on a street and the death of a person from lockjaw days later was not apparent. The city street was background, it was where you walked. Every person who lived in an urban environment walked those streets every day. The danger of the street surface was invisible in the same way that the danger of the water pump was invisible, not because it was concealed, but because it was simply part of the environment that had always existed and through which people passed without incident most of the time. The street also carried deliberate dangers. Gaslights, when they existed, were few and unreliable. Nighttime streets were largely dark. The physical hazards of moving through narrow, unpaved, or poorly paved lanes in darkness, with no traffic management, no pedestrian crossings, and no formal separation between cart traffic and foot traffic, produced regular injuries and deaths. Runaway horses and uncontrolled carts were a constant hazard in cities before traffic regulation existed in any meaningful form. Accident records from 18th and 19th century English cities document a persistent pattern of pedestrian deaths from vehicle strikes, many involving horses moving at speed through streets crowded with people who had no reasonable means of escape. The street was not a special place. It was the connective tissue of daily life. Everyone crossed it, everyone used it, and the range of ways it could kill you was extensive enough that it occupied a unique position in the geography of ordinary danger. Number 5. The job that entire families depended on, performed in rooms where the air itself had already been sentenced. In the textile mills of northern England during the first half of the 19th century, a specific sound became so common among workers that it was considered unremarkable. It was a persistent, wet cough. It appeared in young workers and old ones. It worsened over years of employment. Workers called it by various informal names, and physicians who examined mill workers regularly noted it as a characteristic of the occupation, but the precise mechanism connecting it to the indoor environment of the mills took time to establish with clarity. Cotton dust, when inhaled over long periods, causes a progressive inflammatory condition of the lungs, known today as bisonosis. Workers in cotton carding and spinning rooms were exposed to high concentrations of fine cotton fibers and associated organic dust throughout their working hours. The initial symptoms were characteristically worse on the first day of the working week after a rest, a pattern that confused early medical observers and is now understood as a feature of the disease's inflammatory mechanism. Over years of exposure, the capacity of the lungs diminished progressively and irreversibly. Workers who had spent decades in the mills developed the kind of labored breathing that made even moderate physical effort difficult, and the condition could eventually become severe enough to contribute to death. The mills were not the only environment where occupational lung disease followed workers home each evening. Lead smelting facilities, potteries, and painting trades exposed workers to lead dust that, when inhaled over time, produced the systemic effects of lead poisoning, including neurological damage, kidney failure, anemia, and death. Painters using lead-based white paint mixed and applied the material in unventilated spaces for their entire working lives. Children in households where a parent worked with lead were at risk from contamination carried on clothing and tools. The exposure was cumulative, gradual, and chronic. In English glassmaking and pottery towns like Stoke-on-Trent, workers ground and applied lead-containing glazes and silica compounds in conditions that generated enormous quantities of fine dust. The resulting disease, a combination of silicosis from fine silica particles and lead poisoning from the glazes, killed workers at ages that their contemporaries in other occupations often survived. Parish burial records from pottery-producing areas in the 17th through 19th centuries show patterns of early male mortality that reflect these occupational exposures, though the attribution of specific causes was rarely precise. The reason workers accepted these conditions requires careful context. Most had no alternative. The mills and foundries and potteries of industrial Britain were not optional employers for the families who depended on them. The wages they provided were the difference between a subsistence living and destitution. Children entered these workplaces in the early 19th century at ages as young as 7 or 8, assigned to tasks whose long-term consequences for their lungs or their nervous systems were not visible for years. The dust in the air was not perceived as poison, it was perceived as evidence that work was happening. Physicians who advocated for improved ventilation, reduced working hours in dusty environments, and better workplace conditions faced the consistent resistance of mill owners and industrialists who argued that ventilation would reduce productivity, that the workers had freely chosen their employment, and that the medical evidence was insufficient to compel change. Some of these arguments continued in court and in Parliament well into the late 19th century, even after the medical evidence had become difficult to refute. What survived is the pattern of early death in the burial records. What disappeared is the voice of the worker who coughed through every winter until they did not survive to see another one. Number 4. The procedure that hospitals proudly offered during their busiest decades, which made the chance of dying higher than if you had stayed home. In the early 19th century, a hospital was not a place people went to recover. It was a place they went because they had no other option, and the decision to go there often reduced the chances of survival compared to remaining at home. This is not a characterization imposed by modern judgment. It was observed, documented, and in some cases quantified by physicians who worked inside these institutions and found the mortality figures genuinely difficult to explain. Puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, was a leading cause of maternal death in European lying-in hospitals throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. Women who gave birth in these hospitals died at rates that were measurably higher than women who gave birth at home, attended by midwives. In some hospitals, the mortality rate among postpartum women reached 10, 15, or even 20% during epidemic episodes. The cause, as understood eventually by the Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis working in Vienna in the 1840s, was contamination carried directly from the hands of medical students and physicians, performing post-mortem examinations on cadavers, and then proceeding, without washing their hands, to examine laboring women. Semmelweis noticed that the maternity ward staffed by medical students and doctors had a significantly higher death rate than the ward staffed by midwives. The midwives were not performing autopsies. The doctors were. The connection was statistical before it was biological. Germ theory had not yet been established, and the mechanism Semmelweis proposed involved what he called cadaverous particles, an undefined contaminating material transmitted from dead bodies. He introduced chlorinated lime hand washing, and mortality in his ward dropped dramatically and rapidly. The institutional response to his findings was largely hostile. Senior physicians found the implication that doctors themselves were causing patient deaths to be professionally objectionable, and Semmelweis was unable to secure the broad acceptance of his protocol within his own lifetime. The pattern at his Vienna clinic is well documented. His hand-washing intervention produced a measurable drop in mortality that reversed when the protocol was abandoned or ignored, but the resistance he encountered was also real, rooted in the organizational culture of medical institutions that could not easily accept that their standard practices were actively killing patients. Surgical wards presented a parallel problem. Before Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic surgical technique in the 1860s, drawing on Pasteur's germ theory work, surgical wound infection was so common that it was given its own name, laudable pus, the idea being that some degree of wound suppuration was a natural and even positive part of healing. Surgeons operated in street clothes, reused instruments between patients without sterilization, and considered the smell of a busy surgical ward an unavoidable characteristic of the environment rather than evidence of a systematic problem. Mortality from post-surgical infection in mid-19th century European hospitals was catastrophically high. Compound fractures, where the broken bone pierced the skin, were frequently treated with amputation because infection of an open wound was considered almost certain to prove fatal. The hospital itself was the source of the danger. Not in every case, not in every era, not universally, but consistently enough that the statistical pattern was visible to anyone who looked. The institution that existed to heal was through specific and identifiable practices, increasing the mortality of the patients it admitted. The patients who died from hospital-acquired infection in these wards were not the victims of a natural calamity or an invisible force. They were the victims of practices that later analysis showed could be changed, but which the institutional and cultural structures of medicine resisted changing for decades after the evidence had been gathered. Number 3. The childhood game that every family encouraged, played in the same rooms where a slow poison was settling into the bones. Through much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, one of the most persistent silent toxins in the domestic environment environment was lead. It was in the paint on the walls and the ceiling of virtually every urban household that could afford paint. It was in the solder sealing the joints of water pipes. It was in the glaze on ceramic tableware. It was in the foil wrapping certain foods. It was in the ink on some printed materials. It was in the face paint and cosmetics used by women. It was, in a particularly high concentration, in the white lead paint that covered the interior walls of nurseries and children's rooms, because white lead paint was durable, wipeable, and considered appropriate for spaces that needed frequent cleaning. Lead is a neurotoxin. In children, the developing brain is uniquely vulnerable to its effects. Lead interferes with the formation of myelin sheaths around nerves, disrupts neurotransmitter function, and causes progressive neurological damage at exposure levels that produce no obvious acute symptoms. A child living in a room painted with lead-based paint was continuously exposed through several pathways. Paint on walls and woodwork, as it aged and dried, produced fine dust particles. Children in these environments ingested lead dust on their hands through hand-to-mouth behavior and by handling objects that had been in contact with painted surfaces. Some children, particularly those who were malnourished, exhibited a behavior called pica, the ingestion of non-food substances, which in lead-painted environments sometimes extended to eating paint chips directly. The symptoms of chronic low-level lead poisoning in children are not dramatic in the way that a sudden illness is dramatic. They are subtle, gradual, and by the time they were recognized in the 19th century, they were usually attributed to other causes. Irritability, reduced attention, learning difficulties, behavioral changes, and slow neurological development were the characteristic effects. Without a framework connecting these outcomes to the paint on the walls, physicians attributed them to the child's constitution, to illness, to family circumstances, or simply to the variation in children's development. Acute lead poisoning from very high exposures could produce more obvious symptoms, including vomiting, abdominal pain, seizures, and death. Cases of acute childhood lead poisoning from paint were documented in Australian medical literature as early as the 1890s, where physicians in Queensland observed a pattern of serious illness and death among children in households with painted verandas. The paint used in Australia at the time contained extremely high concentrations of lead, and children who played on painted wooden verandas in warm, dry climates ingested lead dust at exposures high enough to produce clear clinical illness. The Queensland cases were among the earliest documented instances of childhood lead paint poisoning recorded in medical literature, but the industrial response to this evidence was slow. White lead paint continued to be widely manufactured and sold in the United States until 1978, when it was finally banned for residential use. The mechanism of harm was well understood decades before that point. The gap between scientific understanding and regulatory action reflects the commercial importance of the lead paint industry, the lobbying conducted by manufacturers, and the difficulty of attributing a subtle neurotoxic harm, visible only across populations and over time, to a specific product on a specific wall. What the record captures is the pattern of exposure and the timeline of harm. What it cannot capture is the individual child who played and learned and grew up and was never quite the same as they might have been because the walls of their room were painted in a color made durable with lead. Number 2. The most celebrated medical treatment of its era, administered by the most respected physicians in the world, that removed the one thing the body was using to fight back. Imagine lying in a bed in 18th century Philadelphia or London or Paris, seriously ill with fever. A physician arrives. He is educated, credentialed, respected by his community. He opens his bag and removes a lancet. What he is about to do has been the standard medical response to serious illness for roughly 2,000 years, endorsed by texts going back to ancient Greek medicine, refined and codified by medieval Islamic and European physicians, defended in medical school curricula, and practiced with absolute confidence by every qualified physician in the Western medical tradition. He is about to open a vein and remove your blood. Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, was practiced as a treatment for disease across an enormous range of conditions. Fever, inflammation, plague, smallpox, pneumonia, apoplexy, hysteria, and almost any acute serious illness was routinely treated by removing varying quantities of blood from the patient. The theoretical foundation was humoral medicine, the framework deriving from ancient Greek medical thinking in which health was understood as a balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was understood as an imbalance, and since blood was the most accessible humor, reducing its quantity was considered the most direct intervention available. The amounts of blood removed could be considerable. A common adult therapeutic bleed might remove anywhere from a pint to several pints of blood. Patients who did not improve after a first bleeding might be bled again. George Washington, who died in December 1799 at Mount Vernon, was treated for what appears to have been an acute throat infection by a team of physicians who collectively removed somewhere between 5 and 9 pints of blood over the course of approximately 12 hours, in addition to other interventions. Most historians of medicine consider the bloodletting to have been a significant contributing factor to his death, though the precise sequence cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Washington's case is often cited because it is well documented, but the practice that caused or hastened his death was not exceptional, it was standard. The physiological reality is that removing large quantities of blood from a person who is already ill with fever, infection, or inflammatory disease worsens their condition in every measurable way. Fever drives up the body's metabolic demands. Infection requires an active immune response. The immune system's cellular components are carried in blood. The body's ability to maintain blood pressure and tissue oxygenation depends entirely on an adequate circulating blood volume. Bloodletting directly reduces that volume, reduces the delivery of oxygen to tissues already stressed by illness, and impairs the immune response at the moment it is most critically needed. A patient who survived a serious illness despite being bled was surviving partly in opposition to their treatment. The practice persisted so long and so thoroughly because it produced observable effects, which were interpreted as evidence of benefit. Bloodletting caused pallor, weakness, and reduction of fever in some cases. These changes were read as the illness subsiding. What was actually happening was often that the patient's overall physiological state had been sufficiently weakened that the fever response itself was suppressed, not because the infection was being controlled, but because the body no longer had the resources to mount it. The treatment felt like it was working in ways that mapped onto the theoretical framework, and the framework was so deeply embedded in medical training and culture that challenging it required challenging not just a practice, but the entire intellectual architecture of medicine as it had been practiced for 2 millennia. Statistical evidence that bloodletting caused net harm accumulated through the 18th and early 19th centuries. Pierre Louis in Paris applied numerical analysis to clinical outcomes in the 1820s and 1830s and found that patients bled for pneumonia did not have measurably better outcomes than those who were not. This kind of evidence-based reasoning was genuinely novel, and it met resistance from physicians who argued that numbers could not capture the individual judgment required in clinical medicine. The decline of bloodletting as mainstream practice was gradual, uneven across countries and medical traditions, and in some regions extended well into the second half of the 19th century. The physician who bled you believed with sincere conviction that he was saving your life. His teachers had taught him so. His textbooks confirmed it. His colleagues practiced it. The patient who died after being bled might equally well have died without that intervention, and separating the contribution of the treatment from the contribution of the disease in any individual case was beyond the observational capacity of the time. What is clear from the statistical and physiological analysis conducted later is that the most credentialed, most respected, most trusted medical practitioners in the Western world were, in many serious cases, reducing the probability that their patients would survive. The trust was real, the danger was real, and neither of them was visible to the people in the room. Number 1. The daily act that sustained every civilization in history, grown in the fields they depended on, carried to their tables by the same hands that had always fed them. Bread, grain, the stored harvest that made settled civilization possible, the sacks of milled flour piled in granaries across medieval Europe, Byzantium, the Ottoman Empire, and colonial North America, the food that ordinary people ate at virtually every meal of their lives, made from grain that had been growing, harvested, milled, and stored by the communities they belonged to. It was not a luxury, it was the baseline. Without it, people starved, and within it, under the right conditions of cold and moisture, something was growing that could fracture an entire society from the inside. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that infects cereal grains, particularly rye, under specific environmental conditions. A wet spring followed by a mild summer creates ideal conditions for ergot to colonize the grain heads of rye crops growing in the field. The infected grain kernels are replaced by hard, dark, elongated structures called sclerotia, which can be purple or nearly black in color, large enough to be visible among the harvested grain, but easy to miss when grain is milled in bulk and stored in large quantities. The sclerotia contain alkaloids, including compounds chemically related to lysergic acid, and more relevantly, vasoconstrictive compounds that produce effects on blood vessels and the nervous system that, at sufficient doses, are catastrophic. Ergotism presents in two distinct forms. The convulsive form, which predominated in regions with certain dietary and environmental patterns, produced seizures, involuntary muscle contractions, hallucinations, and neurological disturbances so severe that those suffering from them were described by medieval observers as consumed by an invisible fire within the body. The gangrenous form, which was more prominent in parts of medieval France, produced a progressive vasoconstriction that cut off blood supply to the extremities. Hands and feet became numb, then cold, then developed burning sensations so intense that victims described feeling as though they were on fire. As the tissues died from lack of blood, the affected limbs blackened and fell away. This condition acquired a specific name in the medieval period, Saint Anthony's fire, because victims who traveled to the shrine of Saint Anthony of Padua in France sometimes recovered, likely because the journey took them away from the contaminated grain of their home community and into food supplies that were not affected. The epidemics of ergotism, documented across medieval Europe, were not small events. A major episode in the Rhine region in 857 CE left hundreds of people dead. Chroniclers in France documented mass deaths from the gangrenous form through the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. The largest outbreaks affected regions dependent on rye as a primary grain crop, particularly in northern France, western Germany, and the Low Countries. The pattern was tied to specific climatic conditions that promoted fungal growth, which meant that outbreaks followed environmental triggers that recurred unpredictably across years and decades. The experience of living through an ergotism outbreak was bewildering and terrifying in a way that went beyond the immediate physical suffering. People were eating their daily bread. They were eating what they had always eaten, from fields their families had farmed for generations, from grain milled by the same miller who served the whole village. There was no visible sign of contamination in most cases, or at least not a sign that untrained observers could reliably identify in bulk grain. The illness came on gradually, beginning with tingling in the extremities and progressing through phases of worsening symptoms over days and weeks. Within a community, multiple people fell ill simultaneously, which produced the appearance of a collective affliction, a punishment, an invisible force moving through the population. Religious interpretation was inevitable and understandable. The suffering was extreme, the cause was invisible, the onset was collective, and medieval Christianity had an extensive framework for interpreting mass suffering as spiritual in origin. This framing was not simply superstition imposed from outside. It was the only coherent explanatory system available to people who watched their neighbors lose their limbs while eating from the same communal bread. The physicians and clergy of the period did not understand the mechanism. The grain looked like grain. The bread looked like bread. The danger was inside something that was not merely familiar, but existentially necessary. One of the more debated theories in the historiography of ergotism connects fungal grain contamination to specific historical episodes of mass social disturbance. Some historians and researchers have proposed that the Salem witch trial outbreak in Massachusetts in 1692 may have involved ergot contamination of the rye crop grown in the affected area of Salem Village, with the strange physical symptoms reported by the accusers potentially reflecting early ergotism rather than supernatural affliction. This theory, first systematically proposed by the researcher Linda Caporale in the 1970s, remains contested. Other historians have argued that the social, legal, and community dynamics of Salem Village provide sufficient explanation for the events without invoking a biological mechanism, and that the symptom descriptions do not match ergotism precisely enough to constitute strong evidence. The theory is not accepted as established fact, but it reflects how seriously historians have considered the possibility that grain contamination shaped documented historical events. Even without Salem, the documented history of ergotism is long enough and consequential enough to stand on its own. Tens of thousands of people across centuries of European history suffered and died from a fungal contamination of their staple food. They did not know what was causing their suffering. They ate the bread the next day because they had nothing else. The grain that sustained their civilization was the grain that was consuming them, and in that fact lies something that no specific plague, no dramatic military defeat, and no named disaster quite matches for its quiet and persistent persistent horror, the most reliable thing in a person's life. The food that had always been there had become the source of destruction, and neither they nor anyone around them could see it. That is the thing about the dangers on this list. None of them were a warning sign. None of them announced themselves as exceptions to the ordinary. They were the ordinary. The dress, the water, the medicine, the wall, the street, the air at work, the hospital, the nursery, the physician's hands, and the daily bread. All of them were part of a routine that millions of people moved through without question, not because those people were careless or ignorant, but because the information that would have made the danger visible had not yet been gathered, verified, or distributed in a form that reached the people who needed it most. Think about which of these 10 things you would have encountered first if you had lived in, say, 1750. The bread in the morning, the street on the way to work, the water at midday, the walls of your room at night. Some of these dangers ran the full length of a person's life without ever producing a visible event, only a quiet shortening. Which one on this list do you think would have been the hardest to survive? Leave the number in the comments. If this kind of history is what you come here for, subscribe, because there is more where this came from.